Remember when the Millennium Falcon was seen on Coruscant in the prequels? Or how about the time in Empire Strikes Back we saw a TIE fighter pilot fly out of his ship in flames? These are just two of many lesser known moments from the George Lucas saga that I'll be exploring today. And while most of these types of videos would clickbait you and only have like 7 microscopic details, this one has closer to 30 because I'll be showing you a series of shorts I've been uploading from the last year dedicated to these very types of details themselves in a compilation here. Some details from episode 1 that you might have missed. Right after the moment where Darth Maul's lightsaber is cut in half by Obi-Wan during the Naboo duel, we can see Maul swinging his blade behind his back twice. Now while this is a move we see performed many times throughout the movies that you might have assumed to be ornamental, in this scene that is not the case, because if we look closely we can actually see that Maul is doing this to block any attacks from Kenobi as he's getting up back into a fighting stance. Also, remember that guy with the bright orange jumpsuit walking by Mos Espa during the Tatooine section of the movie? Well, his name is Rum Slag, and he's a bounty hunter of an unknown humanoid species that has a ponytail of dreadlocks on the back of his head, which is covered by a mask with a skull painted on it. Lastly, some background characters seen in the movie are a species of aliens in a Senate pod that look identical to E.T., as well as a man that looks exactly the same as Quinlan Vos. So that was in under a minute why in episode 2 does Chancellor Palpatine, for whatever reason, actually look older than he does in Revenge of the Sith. Well, this is because George Lucas was originally planning to show a more natural progression of his face distorting over time from 1 to 6, but then when making Revenge of the Sith decided to go with the origin of Sidious being disfigured by his own lightning. Next up, if you look very closely at the Obi-Wan versus Jango fight on Kamino, you can see the bounty hunter bonk his head on the door of the Slave One, which is actually the cause of the dent we see on his helmet later in the movie. Also, when he is decapitated by Mace Windu in the arena, we can see a shadow disconnecting from the main shadow, meaning his head flew out of the helmet. Lastly, during the Coruscant speeder chase, in the very corner of the screen for a few frames, a trio of TIE fighters can be spotted chasing a lone X-Wing, and while this doesn't make any sense in the timeline, it really makes you glad the pause button was invented, because otherwise you'd be asking questions like you saw the Millennium Falcon in Revenge of the Sith. Because at 23 minutes and 51 seconds, a YT-1300 freighter can be seen docking into the Senate building on Coruscant during the scene after Anakin and Obi-Wan crash land the Invisible Hand. This ship was confirmed by George Lucas to actually be the Falcon and not just another ship of that freighter class. Next up, during the scene where Palpatine reveals himself as a Sith Lord to Anakin, there's a moment right after the Jedi realizes that Palpatine is the hidden Sith, where Sidious briefly jerks his hand almost as if to force pull his lightsaber to him, just in case Anakin tries to actually kill him. Lastly, during the Battle of Coruscant, due to the sequence gaining a reputation among the crew for having so many details, the VFX department decided to put a flaming kitchen sink flying out of one of the ships as a joke. When during the cantina scene, multiple IG assassin droid helmets, including a gold one in the middle, are used for the dispensers of drinks at the bar, which originally comes from engine turbine parts, and it's pretty funny to think that the iconic design was almost just used for a couple of Duros to drink blue milk. When Darth Vader locks into Luke during the trench run and actually fires before Han gets to him, his shots just seem to disappear and don't hit Luke. I kind of hate telling everyone this mistake because I don't want to ruin one of the best moments of the movies, but it is still there. Lastly, during the Mos Eisley scene, we can see the number 94 etched on the wall next to the door leading into the hangar area in a unique pattern. This is notable because George made sure to never show English in the movies to keep them more alien, which would later bring about the birth of Aurebesh. And while I'm sure this detail overanalyzing Star Wars would hate,
Aurebesh? I'm
not sure what he would think about how In Lando and Leia's escape from Cloud City, you can see a man running past with an object that looks like an ice cream maker, and that's because behind the scenes that's literally what it is, an unaltered ice cream maker. The funny thing is that not only would this character known as Willrow Hood get his own backstory in Legends, but this same machine known as a Camtono in the Star Wars universe is also seen in many Mandoverse shows. Also in the incinerator scene in Cloud City, a burned IG-88 appears white and trashed here. That's because Boba Fett defeated and nearly destroyed the assassin droid behind the scenes. Lastly, during the asteroid chase with the Falcon and the TIE Fighters, if you look closely, the first TIE Fighter to explode shows a TIE Fighter pilot flying out of the ship in flames with their arms flailing. I thought this was especially cool because I'd never caught this before, and it makes me wonder if that clone pilot in episode 3 was a reference to all this. It really goes to show you how much the effects evolved, but going right back to the beginning, you saw the Jedi Temple in Return of the Jedi, because during the celebration scene at the end of the movie, not only can the ex-Imperial Palace be seen in the background on Coruscant, but also the Senate building and a crowd surfing stormtrooper. Although something tells me that that Buckethead isn't showing up to Empire Day anytime soon. Also, while as a Star Wars fan you're surely familiar with aliens at Jabba's palace like Jaquil and Max Rebo, if you can remember the Skrilling Jedi from the Clone Wars episode titled Holocron Heist called Ord in Essence, there is a background alien of the same species here called Pote Snitkin, which I thought was pretty dope. Lastly, also at Jabba's palace, you can see on the left side of Jabba's prize, that being Han Solo and Carbonite, a Tauntaun head displayed on the wall, and it makes you wonder if this was maybe from one of Jabba's bounty hunters that got this prize for him. And while you might not have noticed it, it's definitely true that you know everything about Revenge of the Sith, right? Well, what if I told you during Order 66, one of the most crucial scenes in the film, the 327th clones on Felucia are actually riding these things called Gelagrub in the background, which look like rideable 10-legged slugs, and were also known as Felucian ground beetles, as they were technically the largest insects in the galaxy. Moving over to the original trilogy at the Battle of Endor and Return of the Jedi, after the first wave of rebels is surrounded by a mass of stormtroopers, we can actually see one of the captured rebels in the background was wearing a scout trooper disguise, which he must now take off here as he's exposed. So my last microscopic detail to ever happen in this series after half a year of these is actually less of a detail. According to J.J. Abrams, when Finn was sinking in the sand here, he was actually about to confess that he's force sensitive, but you might have to go back to the beginning to prove. It's nearly impossible to notice these droid walkers on Starkiller Base. However, if you look in the background of the firing scene, you'll see the AT-PD, or All-Terrain Patrol Droid, which had two heavy laser cannons powered by a generator in its head. Next up, during the scenes at the Nema outpost on Jakku, especially when BB-8 wheels on past, we can actually see a spare pod racer engine in the background, which hasn't been officially identified as a specific one, at least in canon, but it's kinda cool that in the movie, with so little prequel connection, we at least get this. And while it was removed from the theatrical movie, in the trailer, one of the flags at Maz's castle has Anakin's pod racing insignia on it. Lastly, you might have noticed how the Millennium Falcon has a new rectangular piece on its hull in this movie, and that is of course because in episode 6, Lando knocked the old circular dish off of it. And while that one is often thrown in your face, Carrie Fisher's dog is in The Last Jedi. That's because in the Canto Bight scene, you can see one of the aliens at the casino is holding an alien dog creature that just so happens to be Gary, who is owned by Carrie Fisher to help her cope with her bipolar disorder. Also, there's a reference to the sail barge fight in Return of the Jedi, in which Luke gets shot in the hand because he's just smart like that. In one of the first scenes of this film, you can see Luke's robotic hand reaching for Anakin's lightsaber with some obvious scarring on it on the wrist. Lastly is the door to Luke Skywalker's hut on Ahch-To, which is actually a salvaged S-foil from Luke's X-Wing, and another cool thing about that specifically is that the number of stripes on the foil actually show what number they are in the squadron, like here with Red 5. And I know, how are any of us supposed to know this anyway? Well, I don't know, but at least you'll always remember Did you know that Dengar, the iconic bounty hunter from Empire Strikes Back, actually appears in The Rise of Skywalker? That's because on Kijimi, we can see in the background as the heroes are walking by, this egg-headed guy that, according to canonized lore, is Dengar after undergoing cybernetic surgery after the Galactic Civil War to stay as a competitive bounty hunter. Also, Rey has the same lightsaber fighting style as Palpatine. That's because in the Forest fight from episode 7, we can see her lunging and charging forward in a style similar to Palpatine. Now you might be wondering, how is this a Rise of Skywalker detail? And that's actually because this could be one of the few ways J.J. Abrams could claim to have planned this revelation the whole time, even if that's not true. Lastly, during the scene on Kijimi in the bar, we can actually see a B-1 Bow droid in the background, which also connects to John Williams' cameo in the movie, who is surrounded by relics of the movies he scored in the past, such as a medical droid and this Bow droid as well. Did you hate the thin lightsabers in Rebels? Well, in the scene where Ezra builds his new lightsaber from Ahsoka episode 8, after Huyang offers him an emitter he thinks will do the trick, Ezra denies, saying,
"The blade emitter's too narrow."
This might very well be a dig/inside joke at the animation style of Rebels, which controversially had noticeably narrow or thin lightsaber blades. Also in the last scene we get with the late Ray Stevenson, we see Baylan Skoll overlooking a structure similar to that seen on Mortis, but behind him are some ancient statues, and while you might have thought these to be random Night Sisters, they're actually the father in the middle and the son on the right, with the daughter statue clearly missing. Lastly, Sabine references Yoda when talking to Ahsoka, who asks if she's kept up her training. Sabine at first says "I try," but then corrects it to "I do." And just for a bonus fact, we get a moment with the night troopers blowing up the door, which strongly resembles A New Hope's opening scene. Also, I know this is random, but remember when Clone Wars used to reference the lines from the movies all the time, like every single episode? Well, it looks like Filoni got to pat himself on the back with the Bad Batch, where on Collar, after being defeated by Clone Force 99, one of the Bow droids says,
"I guess I'm in charge now."
a clear callback to when the droid in Destroy Malevolence says this before crashing into a moon. Also, when getting shot down by clone troopers during Order 66, we can see Depa Billapa using Form 3 to defend herself, something we heard the Grand Inquisitor say she used in Rebels when fighting her apprentice Kanan. Lastly, on Pantora, we see Omega get a clone trooper doll, which is very similar to the Stormtrooper doll we see owned by Jyn Erso in Rogue One. Ever wonder what that big statue with Aurebesh is behind Cody and Crosshair here? Well, that's a statue known as the First Battle Memorial, which honors the brave soldiers who gave their lives at the Battle of Geonosis. Next up is this giant mech thing here, which might have confused some of you as to what it is, but turns out the Zepho from Jedi Fallen Order were even more prominent than we thought, as this is likely some form of their technology for warding off interlopers, similar to the guards we saw in that game. During the first episode of the Bad Batch Season 2, when Hunter and Wrecker escape Dooku's office through a lift in the floor, this could quite possibly be a reference to Dooku's escape from Obi and Annie via a hatch, which he may or may not have an obsession for it would appear. Did you catch the Temple of Doom Easter egg in the new Bad Batch episode? Because after Omega releases the beasts here, this guy, officially named Captain Man, can be seen reaching for his blaster as creatures run all around him, identical to Willy reaching for the diamond in Indiana Jones. This might not seem like much until we realize all the other Fedora references in this show so far, such as how this town is named Lao, and there is a club named Lao Che in Season 2, like Lao Che from Temple of Doom. Also, we see Hemlock grip his hand as he does many times throughout the season in this episode, and as Crosshair also does, hinting that there is more to the experiments on Tantus than we've seen so far. Also, did you hear the crates of porgs being lifted off at the beginning of that showdown scene? Well, if that was not a microscopic enough detail, for our bonus round, here's every beast in this episode. Nunas, Void Striders, Rathtars, and probably even more that I didn't catch here.